So, it really feels like the world is just buzzing right now, doesn't it? Kind of in overdrive.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this sense of everything shifting, global power, the economy, even how societies feel fragmented.
Exactly. Every headline seems to scream about massive change, uncertainty. It's a lot.
And that feeling, of being in the middle of something big, maybe even chaotic, well, it leaves people searching, right? Looking for some way to make sense of it all, something deeper than just the daily news cycle.
Totally. And if you were looking for that kind of map, that model to explain these times, one of the really big attempts comes from Ray Dalio, his book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order.
Why nations succeed and fail. And that's what we're diving into today. This deep dive is built right from the sources you shared with us, summaries, bits from the book, analysis of his work.
Yeah, our mission here is pretty straightforward. Jump into that material, pull out the really crucial insights, the core frameworks Dalio uses. We want to help you get up to speed fast on his perspective.
Understand why he thinks nations rise and fall, and maybe more importantly, what that historical view tells us about where things might be headed now.
And it's clearly struck a chord. I mean, look at the endorsements. You've got Henry Kissinger calling it a serious contribution and an urgent warning.
Right, or Bill Gates, Lawrence Summers recommending it. Andrew Ross Sorkin pointed out how it maps these huge sweeps of economic history. A super important must-read.
That kind of reaction tells you something. It suggests this book taps into a real need people feel right now, trying to understand the big picture, the what's happening and why, on a grand scale.
And that feeling, that sense of major shifts, seems to be exactly what got Dalio started on this project in the first place. He was seeing things happening that, well, they felt new in his lifetime.
But weren't actually new if you looked back through history.
Exactly that. He looked around and saw a few really concerning patterns kind of coming together at the same time.
Like what specifically?
Okay, so first he saw, these massive debt burdens, right? Globally. And paired with that, you have these incredibly low, almost negative interest rates, which really ties the hands of policymakers, Traditional tools don't work the same way.
Yeah, you see that impacting economies everywhere. Okay, what else?
Then he observed these really large and growing gaps in wealth, in opportunity, even political gaps within countries, creating a lot of internal stress, division.
That feels very, very current.
And the third big one, maybe the most critical from his historical view, was seeing a rising power, China starting to seriously challenge the existing dominant power, the U.S.
The classic historical dynamic.
Right. And historically, that transition period when one power rises and another might be fading relatively, well, it's often unstable, fraught with risk, even conflict.
Because so Dalio sees the debt, the internal splits, the rising competitor. What did he think was the fundamental mistake in how most people were looking at this? What was the sin, so to speak?
He basically diagnosed this pervasive historical amnesia and short-term thinking. People weren't looking back far enough, maybe just their own lifetimes or the last few decades.
So they were missing the bigger picture.
Missing the recurring patterns, yeah. They weren't recognizing that today's pressures often echo these multi-generational cycles that have played out again and again. And because of that short-term view, he felt people were just unprepared for what he called times that will be very different from anything that we have experienced.
So the failure isn't just not knowing today's facts. It's not seeing how today fits into a potentially repeating story.
Precisely. If you see everything as a totally unique, unprecedented crisis, you misunderstand its real nature, its scale, and you're constantly caught off guard, constantly surprised, less able to respond effectively.
Okay, so if the problem is this historical short-sightedness, what's Dalio's big solution? What's the core idea of the book?
His central thesis is that the world and the nations in it, they operate according to these identifiable long-term cycles. Cycles of order, then disorder, then a new order. He calls them the big cycles.
Okay.
And he argues these cycles aren't random. They're driven by predictable cause and effect relationships, mostly revolving around power, how nations gain it, how they peak, how they eventually lose it.
And the idea is, if we understand these big cycles, we can sort of anticipate, or at least better navigate, the shifts we're seeing now, especially this whole U.S.-China dynamic.
Yeah, it's less about making exact predictions like this will happen on this date. It's more about providing a dynamic framework, a lens for interpretation.
Makes sense.
It helps you look at today's challenges, even the ones that feel totally unprecedented, and see them not just as random chaos, but maybe as stages within a known historical pattern. And just that reframing, that perspective, allows for more reasoned, strategic thinking instead of purely emotional reactions.
Right. But for a framework like that, using history to understand today, it must rely on some pretty fundamental assumptions, right? About how history even works. What are those core beliefs underneath it all?
Yeah, absolutely. One huge assumption is that the deep past, he focuses a lot on the last 500 years, looking at empires rising and falling, their currencies.
Okay.
That this period provides a reliable template, that the basic patterns seen then are still relevant for understanding today and tomorrow.
So even with things like the internet, nuclear weapons, AI, global finance, he's saying the fundamental rules of the game for how nations gain and lose power haven't really changed.
That's the core premise, yeah.
Right.
The belief is that at this big macro level, the plot points gaining power, struggling to keep it, the seeds of decline showing up, they follow a broadly similar script over time. The idea is that human nature, collective behavior, when you look at it over centuries, it has these sort of inertial tendencies, these cyclical patterns that are just powerful enough to keep reasserting themselves. Even if modern factors change the speed or the specifics, the underlying cycle persists.
It's definitely a bold claim in a world that feels like it's changing faster than ever.
It is, and the second big assumption kind of builds on that. It's that the drivers of these historical cycles are themselves timeless, universal aspects of human nature, basically, and how societies work.
What kind of drivers are we talking about there?
Well, things like the basic desire for wealth, for power, the tendency for people and governments to focus on the short term rather than the long term. Generational psychology shifts.
Right.
He sees the cycle itself, that sequence from, say, borrowing too much, leading to bubbles, then wealth gaps widening, sparking internal conflict, then maybe printing money, revolution or war, and finally a new order. He sees that whole sequence as a kind of recurring behavioral script, driven by these fundamental human traits.
So the argument is these deep-seated behaviors are strong enough to consistently shape history across different cultures, different eras.
That's the core belief, yeah. These forces are seen as so powerful that even good policies or strong institutions might manage them for a while, maybe soften the edges, but they probably can't eliminate the cycle entirely. Trying to create permanent stability runs up against these headwinds of human nature.
So things like complacency when you're on top, overreaching internal divisions, they're almost baked into the system over the long run.
According to this framework, yes. There are recurring vulnerabilities tied to these persistent drivers.
All right, so Dalio's foundation is history repeats in broad strokes because human nature and societal dynamics are pretty consistent. How does he build his actual model, his operating system for understanding the world? On top of that, what are the main parts?
Okay, so the first pillar, really the engine driving the whole thing, is the big cycle itself. That recurring multi-generational pattern of rise, peak, and decline for great powers and their economies.
Right, and he breaks this down into phases, doesn't he? Like, you start with a new order emerging, then there's a period of building up prosperity.
Yeah, then reaching a peak, often followed by excesses, things starting to fray, leading into decline, and eventually the breakdown of the old order and the rise of a new one.
Okay.
A good analogy might be, think about watching the ocean. The daily news is like the individual waves crashing on the shore. The big cycle is like the tide itself, that massive, slow-moving shift in the water level. It's the centuries-long flow of power, wealth, and order that really shapes the long-term landscape.
And knowing where you are in that tide, what phase you're in, isn't just interesting history. It has real-world implications, right? For strategy, policy, even investing.
Absolutely. It's meant to provide diagnostic value, where are we now?
Yeah.
And prognostic value, what kinds of challenges or opportunities are likely given this phase.
So applying it today, he might suggest the U.S. is showing signs of, say, a later phase, maybe decline, while China shows characteristics of a rising power.
That's a key application, yes. It helps contextualize current events, trade tensions, military buildups, internal debates within this larger narrative. And it suggests the types of problems that become more probable during certain phases, like increased internal conflict or financial stress during a potential decline phase.
Okay, so the big cycle sets the rhythm. But how do you actually figure out where a nation is in that cycle at any given moment? You need some tools, right? Some gauges.
Exactly. And that leads us to the second pillar, the gauges and livers. These are the specific models he uses to measure a nation's strength and track these critical dynamics. And the first big one here is the National Power Index.
Ah, okay, the power index. That's where he gets into the specific metric. I remember seeing a list.
Yeah, he looks at 18 factors in total, but really highlights 8 key ones. Things like education, competitiveness, innovation, and tech. Economic output, share of world trade, military strength, financial center strength, and critically, reserve currency status. The real power here isn't just listing them, it's using them to build a kind of systematic dashboard. A data-driven way to look at a nation's health across many dimensions, not just one or two indicators. It's designed to spot the underlying trends and shifts in momentum over time.
And these factors aren't separate things, they all connect, right? Like, better education leads to more innovation.
Absolutely. It's a system with feedback loops. Strength in one area can boost others. Weakness can drag others down. The value is tracking those trends across the board and how they interact.
So, for example, he might say the U.S. still scores high overall today.
Right, but maybe shows some worrying negative trends in certain areas, like internal order, those wealth gaps we mentioned. And within the model, those can be warning signs for future trouble, even if the overall score is still high right now.
Okay, so the index gives a broad picture of strength. But you mentioned finance earlier. That seems like a recurring weak spot for empires.
Definitely. And that's model 2 within this pillar, the debt and currency doom loop. Dalio puts a huge emphasis on this pattern. He sees it as a major financial vulnerability, especially late in the big cycle.
And the pattern is, well, nations pile up debt, right? Which is maybe easier if you have the world's main currency.
Exactly, the reserve currency privilege.
But eventually that debt gets unsustainable.
Right.
Then comes political pressure to, print money, expand the money supply.
Right, the easier path than, say, raising taxes or cutting spending significantly.
Which then leads to the currency losing value, inflation picking up, and maybe eventually losing that reserve currency status altogether.
That's the loop he describes. It's a fundamental financial Achilles heel. He explicitly links this long-term debt cycle playing out over decades directly to the life cycle of empires and the fate of their currencies.
So it's not just a short-term budget issue. It's potentially a deep structural threat tied to the whole cycle of power.
That's the argument. It highlights this recurring tension between what's politically convenient in the short term, like avoiding tough fiscal choices by creating more money, and the long-term discipline needed to maintain stability and power.
And having the reserve currency can actually make it worse, by making it seem easier to borrow.
It can encourage that fiscal laxity, yeah. And history shows, as Dalio points out, that pretty much all major currencies eventually get significantly devalued or die out, often because of this exact issue, excessive money printing. Losing that reserve status, if it happens, can really accelerate a nation's decline.
That's a really sobering pattern.
Yeah.
But it's not just about external rivals or finances, is it? Empires can rot from within, too.
Precisely, and that's Model 3, the internal fracture points. Dalio argues strongly that internal cohesion, or the lack of it, is a critical factor. He talks about the internal order-disorder cycle.
And this is driven by those gaps we mentioned earlier: wealth, opportunity, political polarization.
Exactly. When the benefits of the system aren't shared widely enough, or when society gets so divided that different factions prioritize their own causes over the health of the whole, well, internal conflict grows.
And that weakens the nation.
Tremendously. It paralyzes decision-making, makes it harder to address any challenge, whether it's economic or geopolitical. It just makes the country more vulnerable.
So things like social cohesion, a sense of shared purpose,
Yeah.
fairness, these aren't just nice to haves, they're actually core components of national strength and how long a power can last.
That's absolutely central to his view. These internal factors are powerful leading indicators. Rising inequality, deep polarization, he sees these as directly degrading a nation's power and resilience.
Because internal fights hurt the economy, hurt the ability to act.
Right. And in the worst cases, historically, these internal tensions can boil over into revolution or civil war, completely shattering the existing order. He definitely points to the deep conflicts and polarization in the U.S. today as a major red flag within this framework.
It really suggests that how wealth, opportunity, even values are distributed is just as important for long-term strength as how much wealth and power is generated in the first place.
That's a great way to put it. An empire that fails on internal cohesion is basically planting the seeds of its own decline, according to this model. It's a fundamental weakness.
Okay, so we've got the big cycle as the rhythm, then the determinants, the debt cycle, and internal fractures as the key measures and vulnerabilities. But dealing with all this, these are huge, potentially scary forces. How does Dalio's work help someone actually navigate this? Pillar 3, the navigational chart.
Yeah, this part is less about the mechanics of history and more about, well, mindset, temperament. It's not exactly self-help, but the perspective it offers is really important psychologically.
How so?
Well, just understanding that the chaos and upheaval you might be seeing could be part of a recurring pattern. That alone can make it feel less random, less overwhelming, less like you're being blindsided by something totally unprecedented.
Knowing that these kinds of turbulent periods have happened before, that they follow certain patterns, can be strangely stabilizing, even if the pattern itself is disruptive.
Exactly. It helps foster what Dalio often calls radical acceptance of reality. Trying to see things as they are, based on the data and history, even if it's uncomfortable. And it encourages a shift towards a more long-term, probabilistic, systematic way of thinking.
Kind of like applying his general principles for life and work, but on this huge geopolitical scale, using data, thinking in systems.
Precisely. Thinking in scenarios, thinking in probabilities, looking at the long-term interplay of these forces, rather than just reacting emotionally to every headline.
So it's like being in a huge storm, but someone gives you a really detailed map and a good compass.
That's a great analogy. The tools don't stop the storm, right? But they give you a massive advantage. You understand your position better, you have a sense of the storm's likely patterns based on past ones, and crucially, you have some idea of what lies beyond the immediate turmoil. It helps replace raw fear with a more calculated awareness.
So the benefit is almost like building up some intellectual armor, a methodological shield. It reduces that anxiety that comes from pure uncertainty by giving you a framework, a story that makes sense of things.
Yeah, it makes the changes feel less random, more understandable, even if they're still really challenging. And there's an empowerment that comes from that structured understanding, from having a methodical approach. Knowing, as Dalio might put it, what game is being played. It allows for more rational, strategic responses.
It helps manage the emotional roller coaster of living through big shifts.
And ideally leads to better decisions, whether personal or professional.
Okay, so Dalio builds this really detailed model based on centuries of history. But the million-dollar question is always, how well does it really apply today? With all the unique complexities of the 21st century, let's kind of stress test these ideas a bit.
Yeah, this is crucial. The timelessness test, you could call it. Do these old patterns really hold up now?
Well, let's take the obvious one, the U.S.-China relationship. His framework seems almost designed for this, doesn't it?
It really does. You can map it quite clearly. The U.S. exhibiting some characteristics he associates with later stage powers, the huge debt, the deep internal divisions, questions around global commitments.
Right. And then China showing many traits of a rising power, growing share of trade, economic output, tech advancements, military buildup, obvious ambition.
And the National Power Index he created offers a way to track that shifting balance with data, not just narrative. Plus, his framework explicitly highlights the historical precedent. When a rising power challenges the dominant one, things often get very tense, very competitive, and the risk of conflict rises.
Okay, so it seems applicable there. What about the global financial situation? All the talk about massive debt, money printing, inflation, worries about currencies. Does that fit?
It fits very neatly into the debt and currency doom loop model, yeah. The massive global debt levels, the unprecedented monetary expansion we've seen. Dalio's framework helps frame these not just as current problems, but as potential symptoms of those deeper, recurring, structural issues around debt and its political management that have plagued dominant powers before.
So the fact that today's issues seem to map onto these older patterns suggests maybe the fundamental dynamics haven't changed that much.
That's the suggestion. The technology changes how money is created, how trade happens, but the underlying political and human pressures around debt, power, and competition might still be driving things in familiar ways. The tools are new, but the game might be old.
But let's push back. Where might the model start to wobble? What are the big, this time could be different arguments?
This is where the critical perspective comes in, absolutely. One huge area is just the sheer pace and scale of technological change now. Think about AI, biotech, cyber warfare.
Right. Could these create genuine breaks from the past? Change the nature of power itself, or speed up the cycle in ways historical analogies just don't capture?
It's a massive question. Or think about globalization. The level of economic interdependence today is arguably unprecedented. Does that create totally new kinds of systemic risk? Or maybe new buffers, like a sort of mutually assured economic destruction that makes old-style conflicts less likely. Dalio acknowledges globalization's impact, but maybe its systemic role is truly novel now.
And what about truly global existential threats? Climate change, future pandemics. Dalio includes acts of nature as a factor, but could the scale be so different now, potentially civilization altering, that they just override the normal big cycle dynamics?
Yeah, could they be exogenous shocks so big they just reset the game board in unpredictable ways? It's possible.
There's also the question of prediction versus interpretation. Is the model better at helping us understand the present through the lens of the past, rather than accurately predicting the timing of future events, like a crash or a war?
Forecasting complex systems like this with precision is incredibly hard. And yeah, some readers definitely feel the framework is more descriptive or diagnostic than precisely predictive in terms of timing.
And doesn't focusing so much on these powerful, recurring cycles risk downplaying human choice, leadership, policy decisions?
That's the agency versus structure debate, right? While Dalio certainly talks about leadership quality being important, the overall narrative can feel a bit deterministic, like nations are just carried along by these historical tides.
Yeah, does it risk a kind of fatalism? Making people feel like there's nothing that can be done to change the trajectory, maybe understating the potential impact of really decisive action.
It's a valid concern. How much room is there really to break the mold?
Also, building this kind of grand historical model involves making choices, doesn't it? Which metrics to put in the power index, how to weigh them, exactly where you draw the lines between historical phases. There's interpretation involved.
Absolutely. Any synthesis of the scale is open to critique about potential biases in selection or interpretation. And maybe using words like timeless or universal for these complex societal dynamics is a bit strong for some critics.
Are there specific blind spots? Like, we talked about China rising, but does the model fully account for China's unique internal challenges? Things that might make its path different from past rising powers.
That's a really important point. Several analyses highlight factors that could complicate China's ascent compared to a generic cycle. One huge one is the demographics, that looming cliff from the one-child policy. A rapidly aging population, low birth rate. That's a massive headwind for growth that past rising powers didn't face quite like this.
Right, a unique 21st century problem for them.
Exactly. Then there's the internal debt issue, especially around real estate, often described as a potential house of cards, posing systemic financial risks, and maybe the nature of its political system, the emphasis on control, the legal uncertainties for outsiders, the difficulty, perhaps, in building the kind of deep international trust or ethos that often underpin past global reserve currencies.
So these specific internal factors could absolutely bend China's trajectory away from what a purely historical pattern might predict.
They certainly could. These are exactly the areas where the model meets its limits and invites that critical debate about whether this time or this actor is truly different.
Okay, so let's try to pull this all together then. We have the big cycle rhythm, the determinants for measuring strength, the debt cycle vulnerability, the internal order piece, and the mindset for navigating it all. How do they function as a whole system in Dalio's view?
Well, they form this integrated way of thinking about huge long-term change. The big cycle is the fundamental rhythm, the rise and fall over centuries. The determinants, the debt loop, the internal order disorder, those are the vital signs, the key mechanisms, the recurring vulnerabilities that explain how and why nations move through those phases. They're the diagnostic.
And the temperament piece.
That's the mental toolkit. Understanding these patterns, using that principled, systematic approach Dalio advocates. That's how you try to navigate these shifts with more clarity, less panic, ideally making better choices.
So the whole system is really designed to push you to look past the daily noise, the immediate crises, and see the deeper, slower recurring forces that he believes are really shaping our world.
That's the essence of it, yeah.
Okay. So after digging into all of this, if you had to boil it down, if someone listening could take just one core mental tool from Dalio's work and really integrate it into how they see the world, what would be the single most powerful takeaway?
I think I'd have to say it's the big cycle perspective itself, just internalizing that lens.
What does that actually mean day to day? How do you use that perspective?
It means consciously, consistently trying to view current events. You know, the latest economic report, political clash, social trend, geopolitical tension, viewing them as potential reflections of these larger multi-generational patterns.
So asking yourself questions.
Yeah, developing the habit of asking, okay, where might we be in this recurring historical drama right now? What patterns from the past does the situation seem to echo? And based on that historical context, what does this imply about the likely direction of bigger forces over the next, say, 10 or 20 years?
Getting out of just thinking about the next quarter or the next election.
Exactly. Training yourself to look for the tide, not just get swept up by every individual wave.
And why is that specific perspective the most powerful tool to take away?
Because it fundamentally reframes your whole understanding of change and uncertainty. It's the antidote to that constant feeling that this time is completely different and therefore totally chaotic and unpredictable.
It provides a structure.
It provides a scaffold, yeah. A way to interpret complexity. It helps you anticipate the kinds of challenges and opportunities that tend to arise in different historical phases. And honestly, it helps cultivate a kind of strategic patience in a world that feels incredibly impatient and short-term focused.
So by really absorbing this way of looking at things, you move from feeling like maybe a surprise victim of massive forces to becoming a more informed observer, a more prepared navigator, maybe even a more effective strategist in whatever your own sphere is, whether it's business, investing, or just understanding the world. It feels like the meta skill that makes all the other specific parts of his analysis truly useful. It's the key to trying to navigate this changing world order he describes.
It gives you a framework when things feel like they're falling apart.
Or at least changing profoundly. It offers a coherent narrative in the face of what can seem like pure chaos.
Okay, fascinating stuff. So here's a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to maybe chew on after this discussion.
All right.
If Dalio's framework, rooted as it is in these recurring patterns of human nature, political choices, the mechanics of debt and power over centuries, if it suggests that these periods of instability, tension, even conflict, are kind of inherent unavoidable stages within these long cycles.
Does that fundamentally imply that the ideal of true, lasting global stability, or maybe a single world order that stays dominant forever, is that actually an impossible dream? Is instability baked into the system?
It's definitely a question that Dalio's historical lens forces you to confront, isn't it? The challenging thought.
It certainly is.
Yeah.
Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. We really hope exploring Ray Dalio's framework offers you some valuable perspective on the huge shifts unfolding around us. Keep exploring.